3 terrifying real horror stories from around the world, and every one of them started as a normal trip. I collected these accounts from people who were just trying to see the world, and what they walked away with wasn't a souvenir, but a memory that still makes their skin prickle. Listen close. These are true, and they happened far from home when the ground felt most unstable. The first one came from a 24-year-old solo traveler who spent a week in Thailand, chasing beaches and cheap food, the kind of trip that feels safe because the days are full of other people and sunlight. She told me she moved to a quieter hotel on the edge of town, a place that sat between the road and the thin line of jungle, the ocean, a slow white presence beyond the palms. It was the kind of guest house with a creaky balcony and a front desk run by a woman who kept a little shrine and made strong coffee. Everything about it felt small and ordinary, which is what made what followed so unnerving. One evening at dusk, she was on a scooter, the sky bruised purple, headlights of other bikes like scattered fireflies. Another scooter fell into formation behind her, not passing, just matching. At first she thought it was coincidence, a tourist maybe, or someone heading the same way. But the mirroring continued. If she eased off the throttle, the rider behind her did the same. When she turned down a narrow street, he turned down the same street, slowing to watch. The sound of his engine was a constant, soft punctuation. Her heart beat a little louder. She pulled into a gas station because it felt safer to be where lights and other people were. He stopped on the opposite side of the pumps and waited. Not long, she told me, because she left before he had a chance to speak to her, but the memory of him watching, just watching, stayed with her all the way back to the hotel. The next day, going to the beach, she saw the same jacket. From across the sand it was a flare of color on a scooter idling by a cluster of palms. He didn't approach. He didn't do anything overt. He didn't have to. The sight of him sitting there made the whole day taste thin. She tried to laugh it off, blamed jet lag, told herself to be rational. But that night, at 2 a.m., when the hotel corridors were quiet and the fan in her room clicked like a careful clock, she heard footsteps outside her door. She remembers the sound so clearly, slow, testing. Someone jiggled the handle, light as a question. She lay still until the noise stopped, trying to tell herself it was a drunk guest or maintenance, that she was safe with a deadlock bolted behind her. Then there were steps at the window. She says she went rigid, careful as breathing, and crept the curtain aside enough to let one slit of light through. Outside on the narrow strip of sand beneath her second-story window, a man crouched, his face shaded by the brim of a cap. He was close enough to see if someone moved, close enough that she could smell wet fabric and the faint motor oil of a scooter. The world contracted. For a moment she couldn't tell whether to scream, to run, to call the front desk. The man moved like someone practicing invisibility, crouched and deliberate, listening perhaps for her movement. Then he bolted, as if surprised to be seen, and the motel returned to the indifferent hum of the fan. Morning arrived like relief. She told the front desk what she had seen. The owner, a woman who had always seemed so benign, did not act surprised. She told the traveler the man was known locally, the kind of figure who watched tourists and followed them back. The word known sounded like a cautionary map, not unknown danger, but danger with a pattern. She checked out at first light, moving to a busier hotel in town, and the owner pointed out the route the man often took, quiet and routine. Later, at a small convenience store, she saw him again, stopped briefly, head down, waiting for something. And this time there was no chance to be mistaken. The sight sent a cold wash through her chest. She left the town that day and did not go back. What stayed was less a story of violence and more the feeling of being measured, of someone tracking you with an intimacy that was intended to be invisible. How precise can someone be when they decide to follow another's days? That's the thing that haunts her most. If you like true travel horror, subscribe for the rest of this series. There are more stories that will make you double-check the locks on your next trip. The second story happened in Brussels and came from a 17-year-old student on a school trip. She sounded younger when she described it, the voice still carrying that half-laugh of someone who wants to convince herself she was fine. The setup is blunt and common. Late night, a phone that dies at the worst possible moment, and an unfamiliar neighborhood that looks like a bruise in the dark. She'd matched someone on Tinder, another teenager, she says, and met up at a cheap cafe. The night didn't feel threatening at first. There was laughter, the false security of someone who also spoke English, and a walk back under sodium streetlights. Then the battery icon gaped empty, and the map that would have guided her home vanished. Rain started as a fine, steady needle. The streets folded into slick mirrors. A man appeared as if he'd been there all along, offering directions with an urgency that felt almost professional. He spoke in a language she didn't pass well, the consonants blunt and clipped, but he looked honest. He put a hand on her shoulder and guided her through alleys that smelled of wet cardboard and late-night frying oil. He said he knew the way to the hostel, and insisted on escorting her. She was tired and gullible, and maybe still warmed by the night's company. When they reached the boys-only hostel she and her roommates shared, the man knocked softly. Someone in the lobby opened the door, and he slipped inside with them. She remembers the automatic click of locks and the small warmth of the reception area. He left after a few minutes, and she walked upstairs, showered, and fell into a rough sleep. At 4 a.m., a flashlight was inches from her face. She woke with a wet scream of disorientation. The light stabbed into her eyes, making everything sharp and raw. A man stood over her bed, claiming he was looking for a student's missing visa. He shone the beam at the rows of bunks, peering into sleeping faces, as if the documents were visible in the moonlight. Students woke up in a handful of rooms, groggy and frightened, and then confusion rippled into alarm. The man rummaged with a practiced nonchalance, as though his search was official. He moved from room to room, pushing doors, rifling through backpacks and bedside drawers. Some students tried to block him. He spoke fast and smoothly, a script that sounded like authority. By morning, the tally was bleak. Visas, laptops, and personal items gone from several rooms. The man had vanished before anyone could call the police. When officers finally arrived, they took statements and walked through the hostel with the mechanical calm of people who process loss frequently. The students were left with the hollow, sticky feeling of violation and a dozen questions about choices made in the dark. The narrator of this account kept returning to one. Did we let him in? Was the man the same person who guided her there? Or had he slipped inside earlier, waiting in the shadows? There was no clean answer, only a lingering wash of guilt that sometimes feels like ownership of what happened. She replayed her own steps until the details blurred, turning over the small decisions, the handshake, the trust, the convenience, as if recriminating could rearrange facts. What she wished most, she told me, was not safety tips, but more empathy. The students had been kids abroad, tired and trusting, and the aftermath was a study in how quickly ordinary kindness becomes suspicious memory. The police did what they could, but arrests were slow. For a while she didn't open her email attachments, didn't leave her belongings out, and woke at the faintest unfamiliar noise. The theft robbed more than items. It took some of the ease from travel, the assumption that you are mostly safe among strangers. If you thought that was tense, wait until you hear what happened in Norway. The third story was less about a single person and more about a small group. Friends driving north toward Lofoten, a place famous for its light and long roads that feel endless at night. They were exhausted from hours of driving, music low, the landscape a dark theater of fjords and sky. Passing cars are normal. Drivers drift past, like fish in the current. But one car, a Golf, passed them and then, minutes later, pulled into their lane behind them. At first it was an annoyance, another driver who didn't like the pace. Then the Golf's lights came on full, a floodlight mounted on its roof carving a white wedge across the road. That beam followed them like an accusation, bright and intrusive. They tried common evasions, pulling over at a well-lit viewpoint, stopping to check the map, taking an exit, but the car reappeared each time, the floodlight cutting through the dark with the same mechanical persistence. The group felt watched, boxed in by headlights that didn't look away. On narrow Norwegian roads, there is nowhere to hide, just edges and cliffs and thin shoulders. Minutes stretched, and their anxiety tightened. What began as an uncomfortable tale turned into a stalk. Then a second car joined, then a third. The three vehicles formed a convoy, closing around them like a ring. The drivers flashed lights now, a coordinated pressure that suggested intention rather than chance. They headed for the nearest police station, a small building with a single wall of glass, hoping for help. When they arrived, the station looked closed and dark, the parking lot empty except for the gravel and the wind. For a long time they sat in their car. The breath steamed inside the windows, listening. Finally, an officer arrived. One person, tired but alert. He put them in his van and drove them back to the station where there was a brief confrontation. The officer walked toward the lead car and spoke. For a while, the three cars idled like hungry animals. The officer radioed in details, asked for registration numbers, for the license plates. The convoy scattered when the police presence tipped the balance, and the group was able to get a police escort out of the area. No one was physically harmed, but the threat had been explicit, and the feeling of being cornered on roads that seemed to belong to no one but themselves stuck with them like residue. What this group felt most, even after the police helped, was the jolt of being vulnerable in a place that had felt safe on maps. Norway's roads can be beautiful and solitary in daylight. At night, they can be isolating. Knowing that strangers could coordinate to intimidate them on a remote stretch left them shaken. They talked about how different things looked when there were three cars following instead of one, like predators turning a pass into a hunt. Afterwards, back at a hostel with the kettle going on repeat, they laughed a little at their own fear, but the laughter was thin. In the quiet hours, the question kept returning. What if the police hadn't come? How quickly can a scenic route turn into a scenario where help is not immediate? Across all three stories there's a pattern. The ordinary becomes uncanny, a scooter ride, a friendly helper, a passing car. Each of those little things could belong in millions of uneventful days. What turns them into horror is the way behavior repeats, the way proximity becomes scrutiny, and the way options narrow until the only choice is to act from instinct. None of these accounts included an explicit attack. None ended with the kind of violence that would make headlines. That's what makes them more chilling. They linger as near misses, as the kind of things that can replay in the mind because there was the possibility of something worse, and that possibility was never far away. After each of these close calls, people made very human decisions. To leave, to report, to check out at first light, to accept a police escort. Those steps did not erase the experience. They didn't turn off the memory or neutralize the fear. Instead, they left something else, a heightened awareness and a new set of questions about how we travel and what safety really means. Traveling always involves a measure of luck and a string of small choices that, when aligned wrong, can put you in the wrong place at the wrong time. That doesn't mean you should stop. It means you should be honest about the fragility of the assumption that the world will always be benign. There are a few simple reflections that threaded through every account I heard. First, solitude sharpens vulnerability. When you're alone or in a small group, your options narrow and the judgment calls feel heavier. Second, ordinary kindness can be a mask. A helpful hand or a polite stranger can be sincere, but it can also be the first move in a pattern you only see later. Third, authorities sometimes help, but their reach is not omnipotent. In Thailand, the hotel owner knew something but couldn't make the stalker disappear. In Brussels, police processed statements but couldn't immediately reverse the theft. In Norway, a single officer's arrival changed the dynamic, but the convoy had already done its psychological damage. If you travel, keep these stories as cautionary echoes, not as reasons to fear the world. Pay attention, trust your instincts, and when something feels off, make choices that preserve your margin for escape. Share your location with someone, keep a charger or battery pack for your phone, and avoid being boxed in by too many small conveniences that make you accountable to strangers. But don't let fear become the lens that ruins every trip. There is a balance between caution and paranoia. These stories push us to find it. I'll end with a thought that each storyteller returned to in one form or another. It's not always the violent act that stays. It's the way your life gets measured by other people's choices. A man crouched under a window at 2 a.m., a flashlight inches from a sleeping face, a convoy of cars with floodlights on a narrow road. None of those moments were supposed to be part of a trip itinerary. They shuffled people's ordinary days into a version of fear they hadn't signed up for. There's a small, cold place in the chest you only notice after something like that happens. A place where luck sits and where the question, what if, hovers. If you've had a night that didn't feel right on the road, or an encounter that left you wondering how close it all came to going worse, share it in the comments. Tell your story. We learn from each other's close calls. And if you want more of these real travel horror stories, subscribe and come back. There are more accounts that will make your next evening baggage check feel a little more necessary. Stay alert, travel carefully, and remember that sometimes the scariest thing about a trip is how quickly the familiar can turn to threat.